Hello everyone, I'm Carrie Bird, and this is my new Mizutsune project. I know this video is super long, but bear with me. This guy took a very long time to finish. This is actually the third one I've made now, except he's a little bit smaller than the others. Still just as detailed because I don't know how to restrain myself, but I'm sure my client who commissioned me isn't complaining. So the first thing I need to do is start with an armature. I use a very thick wire for this so that his whole body is super sturdy. It usually gets pretty sturdy on its own through felting, but the wire definitely helps out a lot. I use a 16 gauge wire for the main body and bend it into the rough shape of Mizu's body. Once I'm happy with the shape, I start wrapping a layer of core wool around the wire tightly. Core wool can be really anything you want it to be, but you can usually buy it in bulk for a decent price. Once wrapped, I like to secure it with yarn. Doing this, I've found, keeps the wool tightly packed and skips a lot of time I used to spend felting this first layer. After that, I start felting on more layers of wool to build up the shape of the body. Keep in mind that you will eventually be covering the core with more wool in the color that you actually want, so it's easy to bulk it up too much if you're not careful. Start sculpting the head first over anything else, mostly because it's easy to accidentally make it either too big or too small, so I just sculpt the rest of the body to match that. I start it almost the same way as the body, just without the wire. I could use a wire, but I feel like the head is just small enough where it isn't really necessary, so I ball up the wool tightly and then tie it together with the yarn again. I don't make it too firm at first because I will be going over it a lot more after this for the details, and if it's too firm it gets really hard to felt. While doing this, I constantly check the size compared to the body so that it isn't too off. It's easy to get carried away and just felt a ton without checking just for it to be too big in the end, and let me tell you, it really sucks to have to redo it after you get it perfect the first time. For the eyes, I felt a lot in one spot to create a little indentation in the face. Again, I don't felt too much so that I can still put in the eye details later. Symmetry is always the worst part, so I'm constantly checking both sides as I go to make sure things are looking good. I try to do both sides at the same time instead of focusing too much on one side first because it's much easier for the details to match up that way. Shapes change a lot as you build up the structure, so I just do a little bit at a time and I usually don't have much of an issue that way. those little horns, I do use a smaller wire so that they keep their shape really well. The easiest way I've found to work around wire like this is to felt out a larger sheet of the color and then wrap it around the wire. In the past, I've had trouble with the wire showing through the felt if I put it on loose, so felting it first like this prevents that from happening. Even though felting would be enough, I like to put glue on the end of the wire when I go to attach to the body just to make it a little bit more secure. Another problem I used to have was the wire poking through the end of the piece after I finish it, if I move it the wrong way. To keep that from happening, I now put some glue on my fingers and rub it onto the tip of the horn and kind of mold it into the shape that I want. This keeps the wire from escaping and it gives the horn a nice point. The glue I use is E6000. I'm sure there's a better glue out there for this, but it's just what I had lying around, and it dries clear, so it works out for me. Pieces on. It's basically a long metal rod with a point at the end that's good at making holes for things like this. When I don't use it, I tend to lose the hole I made and the wire won't go in super easy. gluing some loose core wool to the back of the head so that when I go to attach it to the body, I have something there to attach. For his fins, which all have more specific shapes, I make a wire frame to go underneath for stability. Same thing here, I felt large chunks at a time to attach so that the wire doesn't show through super easy. Start to go over the whole body in white wool since that's the main color of Mizu's body. While doing this, I finish bulking up some of the areas to get them close to the right shape and size that I want them to be. I'm back to using the 16 gauge wire. I'm also making the pairs of legs one piece because I had issues in the past where the legs would splay apart a lot just because of the sheer weight of the body. So doing them together keeps them in place and holds up the body very well. try to make the wire for the legs a little bit shorter than they're supposed to be because wool will be added on top and add to the bulk. Like the head, it's very easy to make these too big, so be mindful of that as you go. Getting his feet right was actually quite difficult because there really aren't many references at all for Mizu out there. I managed to find one that looks like some kind of concept art that does show a detailed image of his feet, luckily. It was also quite annoying because every single reference I found was very different from the other, so it made it very hard to know what certain parts actually looked like in general. So for all my Mizus, I go off of that concept art I found. It isn't the most accurate to the games themselves, but I liked how everything looked on it, so that's what I went with. To make the feet, I start by bulking out the palm and then adding the toes onto that. The toes are just little balls of wool. After I put them on, I felt little lines between each toe to give the impression that they are separate from each other. And of course, the most important part of this whole project are the toe beans, which I am absolutely delighted to find out in-game Mizu actually has. I'm going to be making the scale plates on his legs. The way I do this is I start with a darker color first, whatever would be in between the plates, and then I put strips of white on top for the scales themselves. I don't felt them on completely so that they're flush with the body. I keep them raised a little bit so that there's a bit of texture and everything isn't too flat. I take long strips of wool roving and place them on the spots they need to be. Then I felt the center of the strip into the body really well, fold the piece in half, and then felt the edge. I always start with longer pieces than I need so that I can trim it down to size later. Then I just keep going in rows until the fur is on how I want it to be. I recommend marking the body like I did with a marker if your sculpture has patches of fur in places like this and not just all over. Once it's all on, I comb through the fur really gently with my needle, being careful not to snag too much because it's pretty easy to pull out large chunks. I usually save the fur part for the end because it gets matted super easily when you touch it a lot, but I needed to do it now in order to start all the body's details. At the end, I definitely need to give it another combing. Then I go through and carefully cut the fur to the right size. I don't like to cut straight edges, so I go in at an angle with my scissors. If it's too uniform, it doesn't really look natural to me, unless that's the look you're going for. You should only cut off small bits at a time because you can always make it shorter, but it's a huge pain to fix it if it's too short. these bigger scales, I felt a small piece super firmly, focusing a lot on the edges. I do this because I then cut out the shape of the scale, and if the piece isn't firm, then cutting it will make the piece looser and eventually the fibers will fall apart. You don't have to go too overboard with the firmness, just enough where you can tug on the edges and it doesn't really give. Small scales are the same idea as the arm plates. I put a color down underneath and felt little balls of wool on top. I don't completely cover the piece in scales, I usually use them sparingly. That's just my style though. I do it to give the illusion that the thing I'm making is scaly without just covering the thing in scales completely. Not only does it save time, but I think it wouldn't look that good if I cover him head to toe anyway. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of scales, I then put a thin layer of white on top. This way the scales aren't too jarring and stick out too much. It blends it in with the rest of the body. Now I move on to the claws and teeth. For these I like to use super sculpty clay. I like this particular clay because I've noticed fingerprints really don't show up on it, and it's super easy to use. I start by rolling out long clay noodles to about the thickness I want the claw to be, and then cut them to the right size. Then roll out the ends to a point and curve them into the right shape of the claw. After getting the right shape, I stick a little wire inside the clay right before baking. Gluing the clay directly to wool doesn't really work, so it's important to have this wire to stick inside the wool. This clay bakes at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes for every 1/4 of an inch of clay. My pieces are pretty thin, so I only needed to bake them for about 10 minutes. For paint, you really don't need to use the expensive stuff. Here I just use folk art and it works out really well for me. I start with the very first base color and paint all the claws that solid color. Next I put on very light coats of a darker color. I dry brush it on and use my fingers to pick up some of the paint on the ends to blend it in a bit. I do this for each claw again so that these layers can dry before the next. I keep adding more darker colors by dry brushing until it gets to how I want it to look. Lastly, I put on a layer of purple on the top of the claws as a little bit of a highlight. I don't really try to go for realism, which is why they look rough and messy. That's just how I like to paint though. Once the claws are dry, I then finish them with glossy Mod Podge. This protects the paint and gives them a really nice shiny finish. I let the Mod Podge dry for 15 minutes and then add an extra coat. To Put the claws on, I made a hole in the toes and glued the end of the wire. When I put the wire in, I press and hold it for a little bit to let the glue dry slightly. Pushing and holding it like this will keep the wire from being exposed and lets the wool kind of mold around the claw and make it look more like it's a part of the creature rather than something that was glued on. To add on to that look, I also felt on a small strip of wool at the base of the claw. I try to do this right after putting the claw on, before the glue has time to dry, because once it does, it makes the wool in that area very hard and almost impossible to felt through. I originally made the teeth out of clay like I showed earlier, but I put them on and I absolutely hated how it looked. So I tossed them and decided to felt them instead. I just made little pointy pieces and used glue to help them keep their shape. So here I made a bunch of larger scales for the back of Mizu's head. I wait until the very end before I felt them on because as I add new scales, I constantly have to readjust the old ones. So I just use pins to keep them in place before I'm ready to commit to their location. Occasionally I like to go in at the end with a bit of chalk pastels. I really like these since they stick to wool really well, and you can use them to make a smooth gradient that wouldn't be very easy to do with wool. After a while I realized I made the spikes on his legs a bit too purple, so here I'm going over them and adding a bit of red so that they don't stand out so much. And with that, he's finally done.